parts of brain which were formed from prosencephalon. Remember our first topic on brain, and we discussed the development of brain. Well, eventually we are here, and we are with the diencephalon that is located above midbrain, sagittal dissection, and the diencephalon, intermediate brain, is formed between telencephalon, hemispheres, will be discussed today also, and midbrain, it's a little bit below. Diencephalon is divided into two big portions. The first is thalamic brain or thalamencephalon. The second is the hypothalamus. Thalamencephalon, it has three subdivisions. The first subdivision is thalamus. You see these ovoid-shaped structures, oval. They are thalamus. In the thalamus, there are two parts. The anterior tubercle is in front, and this enlargement, it's called pulvinar. The superior surface of thalamus is limited by the stria or stripe. It's called stria. It's called the stria between the medial surface and superior surface of thalamus. This medullary stria directed backwards and continues into the part of the thalamic brain that is called epithalamus. Superior and the surface directed to the same surface of the opposite side of thalamus, this one, it's called the medial surface, limited by the sulcus terminal, by the medullary sulcus that is covered with the medullary strip. The pulvinar, the part where the visual centers are located. Subcortical visual centers, it's again, they don't depend on our consciousness, they are reflectory centers of vision. You see, we know already that the centers of vision were here in superior colliculi of midbrain, and the second subcortical center is here in pulvinar of thalamus. The anterior tubercle is the subcortical center of nearly all sensory tracts. It's like sensory gate for tracts to get the cortex of brain. It's here. So pain, temperature, touch, vibration, so all of them will be terminated in anterior tubercle, the main reflexory subcortical centers. To limit the superior surface of thalamus from the parts of telencephalon, it was removed, should be located here. We have one more sulcus and strip located on it. The sulcus is called terminal sulcus, and terminal stria formed on the surface of this sulcus. It's border between telencephalon, located on the lateral portion, and the thalamic brain, thalamus itself. The medial surfaces of the both parts of thalamus form the lateral wall of the third ventricle. The third ventricle is a cavity of diencephalon. Now we are in the third ventricle, this one. The part of thalamic brain located above it, it's called epithalamus. We demonstrate it here. Epithalamus includes the following structures. The medullary strip continues into the trigone, and this trigone is called habenular trigone, trigonum habenule. Habenulars themselves, these parts of the epithalamus, and commissure located between them. Together, these structures fix one more part of epithalamus called epiphysis or pineal gland. It was not preserved. It's formed a little bit behind habenulus, and you see it's protruded in the groove between the superior colliculi of midbrain, and in general it looks like the fifth tubercle, yes, here. But the colliculi are the parts of midbrain. This one, pineal gland or epiphysis, is a part of epithalamus. Epiphysis or pineal gland is important to regulate the wakefulness, the sleeping biorhythmical centers are located here. The hormones which regulate the speed of growth and the formation of the secondary of the speed of growth to regulate it, and the formation of the signs of the reproductive system. So it's epiphysis here located absent in this portion. One more part of thalamic brain is the metathalamus or subthalamus. You remember when we demonstrated the brachium of the superior and inferior collicles, we talk about brachium, and brachium continues into the lateral geniculate body and medial geniculate body. Where it is, brachium is here, the geniculate bodies will be beneath the thalamus. Geniculate body, that is lateral geniculate body, is the part. Could you please do it this side? The part of the visual center. Below we have the hearing center, that is the medial geniculate body. Because no one sees. You can do it aside a little bit because people don't see. Understand? So this one is the lateral geniculate body and medial geniculate body. Medial is the visual center, subcortical, of course. The lateral is the visual center, the medial is the hearing center. So we know already, as far as you understood, 3 subcortical visual centers. The superior colliculi, it was the first, pulvinar of thalamus, it was the second, and the third is the lateral geniculate body. And 2 subcortical centers of hearing, the inferior colliculi and the medial geniculate body. So 2 subcortical centers of hearing. So the role of the geniculate bodies, they are subcortical centers. The parts which were described, so thalamus, epithalamus and metathalamus, together they form thalamencephalon or thalamic brain. But as you remember, we have the second part of intermediate brain that is called diencephalon. Where is located? It's located on the inferior surface of hemispheres here, or we can find it also here. And hyper means below. Therefore, hypothalamus located below the hemispheres of brain, below thalamus. So what is included in hypothalamus? First of all, we can see optic chiasm. This one, optic chiasm, is the part where the crossing optic nerves occurs. The parts of the fibers go to the opposite side, and this crossovering is formed. That is decussation of optic nerves. It's called optic chiasm. Therefore, the information from one retina is directed to the both hemispheres. In front of it, you see this hole, yes? In this hole, it was the gray matter, tuber cinereum, it's called, or gray tuber, that fixes the infundibulum and hypophysis. Pituitary gland is fixed here. You can ask why we don't have it here. When we discuss the structure of the meninges of brain, we are talking about the diaphragm that covers sella turcica, and in this diaphragm there is a hole through which the infundibulum passes. The hypophysis will be located below this diaphragm. Therefore, when the brain is taken from the skull, the hypophysis remains on the surface of the sella turcica. Therefore, you don't find specimen with hypophysis. Hypophysis was lost when the brain was removed from skull. but you should show the place where it should be. It will be here, the hypophysis that is fixed to infundibulum and great tuber. It will be here. The role of hypophysis is extremely manifested important role. It's the main part of brain that regulates homeostasis, to maintain the homeostasis. A lot of vegetative centers are projected here, a lot of them. So centers of sleep, and again, centers of aggression, centers of the sexual arousal. There are centers of feeding, water intake, temperature balance, and many, many other centers. So vegetative centers. Also, it produces hormones with reciprocal connections with other endocrine glands of the human body. What does it mean? If, for example, it produces hormones which activate the thyroid gland, pancreas, the gonadal glands, and other glands of the human body, yes, their function is decreased. And opposite, when it's decreased and it's necessary to stimulate it, it produces more volume of hormones to activate it. So it's connected with hypothalamus through the reciprocal connections. The cavity of the set ventricle is the cavity of the intermediate brain. And the hypothalamus and hypophysis also forms the inferior floor, the fundus of the set ventricle. What else is included in hypothalamus? So we talked about optic chiasm, about the hypophysis with tuber and infundibulum. Behind them, you see these two round-shaped structures. They are called mammillary bodies. Mammillary bodies. They are parts of limbic system. Limbic system, it's responsible for our emotions, limbic system. And also they are related with the olfactory analyzer. Behind them, there is one more part of hypothalamus that is called the posterior perforating substance. Posterior perforating substance. Posterior perforating substance is formed in the interpeduncular fossa, limited by the cerebral peduncles. Here is it, posterior perforating substance, this one. It was hypothalamus, and the part of the intermediate brain. What about the set ventricle? To limit the walls of the set ventricle, the lateral walls are formed by thalamus. The posterior wall is formed by epithalamus. The inferior wall will be formed by hypothalamus, and anterior wall is formed by the fornix. Fornix is the structure that continues downwards as the columns of fornix, and it has also legs or crus of fornix. Fornix limits anteriorly the set ventricle, and between the parts of fornix there are interventricular openings, interventricular foramina, which lead to the lateral ventricles. Well, from anterior part, the set ventricle contacts with the lateral ventricles. Posteriorly, it contacts with the cerebral aqueduct. There are the protrusions or recesses formed in the posterior wall, where the epiphysis is located, and inferior wall. The optic recess that is coincident with the optic chiasm located here, and there are also infundibular recess that is the same place where infundibulum with hypophysis are located. It was diencephalon. The second part of prosencephalon is telencephalon. Telencephalon is represented with hemispheres, right and left hemispheres. The surface of them is covered with gray matter. There are basal ganglia located inside, And the part of the telencephalon also include the rhinencephalon or olfactory brain. To talk about the hemispheres, so you see telencephalon will be divided into several classes. So for this class, together with diencephalon, you should know the hemispheres, their surface. For next time, the other parts of telencephalon will be studied. Right and left hemispheres. You see between them there is a longitudinal fissure. The superior lateral surface of hemisphere, we can observe it. The inferior surface of hemisphere, and there is medial surface of hemisphere. The frontal pole directed forward, the occipital pole directed backwards, and we have also temporal pole. What is our role now to explain, and then you will use your copies with the picture to demonstrate the surfaces of hemispheres, and you will draw it on these copies, the grooves on the surface of hemispheres and the protrusions located between them, which are called gyri. So one gyrus, and if they are plural, they are gyri. But before we'll describe each of these grooves and gyri formed between them, we should divide each hemisphere into lobes. It's more convenient to use the sagittal dissection. In this case, it's right hemisphere. To start with, we should find the anteriorly located frontal lobe. To limit it, we'll get the lateral sulcus. Beneath this sulcus, there is a temporal lobe. And the second sulcus is called the central. So you see central sulcus is the sulcus to limit the frontal lobe, to form the frontal lobe in front. So this is frontal lobe. The second lobe is temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is limited by the lateral sulcus, this one. The next, we should divide the occipital lobe. How to do it? On the medial surface, there is a Parieta occipital sulcus, and we'll move downwards from the end of this sulcus, and imaginary line to go downwards means that the part of brain located behind is occipital lobe. The part is in front is parietal lobe. And the last, so we have frontal, temporal, occipital, and parietal. The last lobe is called insula. To find it, we go inside the lateral sulcus, and inside we have insula. It's one more lobe, insula. Now we divide each of these lobes into gyri and sulci. So first, the frontal lobe is the superior lateral surface. In front of the central sulcus, we have the precentral sulcus. They divide together the precentral gyrus. From precentral sulcus, there are superior and inferior frontal grooves, and they divide the superior frontal gyrus, medial frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. So we divided frontal lobe into 4 gyri. To make it less difficult, we have the picture from the Atlas book, and you are welcome to use it for your copies to draw the same structures as is demonstrated on this surface, superior lateral surface, and what we are talking about. So we have the central sulcus in front, the precentral one, to divide precentral gyrus, and then the superior and inferior frontal grooves to divide it into the superior, medial, and inferior frontal gyri. We can pay attention to the inferior frontal gyrus that is subdivided into 3 little parts. They are subdivided by little rami or ramus, rami, or branches, that is 3 portions to be developed from them. One is triangular part, it has the shape of triangle, orbital part, located a little bit in front and below it, and opercular part. 3 parts additionally divided into the inferior frontal gyrus. The next is parietal lobe. Behind the central sulcus, we have one more post-central sulcus. Post-central sulcus continues into the intraparietal sulcus. As a result, we have the post-central gyrus, superior parietal lobulus, and inferior parietal lobulus. Where is here? We have post-central sulcus, continues into intraparietal, and as a result we have post-central gyrus, superior parietal lobulus, and inferior parietal lobulus. And in this inferior parietal lobulus there are 2 additional parts. One part, it surrounds the end of the lateral sulcus. You see this one here. It's called supramarginal part. The second surrounds the superior temporal sulcus. It's called angular part. This one. It's additional 2 gyri, the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus, which are also the parts of the parietal lobe. Occipital. Occipital lobe does not have any stable, constant grooves and gyri, and only one that is more or less stable is transverse, located here. The next is temporal. Temporal is divided into 3 gyri, superior, medial, and inferior temporal gyri. They are divided by the superior and inferior temporal grooves. So we have the superior temporal gyrus, limited by the lateral sulcus and superior temporal sulcus. The medial temporal gyrus, limited by superior and inferior temporal grooves, and the inferior temporal gyrus, you see it's below the inferior temporal sulcus. It was superior lateral surface of hemisphere. You will repeat the same names on your papers with the same stamp of brain. Now the medial surface. Medial surface is characterized by the presence of the sulcus of corpus callosum. This part is called corpus callosum. Above it we have sulcus of corpus callosum. A little bit above it we have the singular sulcus, and together they limit the singular gyrus, this one. Behind there is the calcarine sulcus, and in front there is a parietoccipital sulcus. The continuation of the central sulcus, this one, and the parietoccipital sulcus limit the part of the brain called the precuneus, whilst the part that has the shape of triangle between the parietoccipital sulcus and calcarine sulcus, this part is called cuneus. In front, the end of the central sulcus, the paracentral lobulus is located here. Inferior surface. On the inferior surface, near the frontal lobe, there is the olfactory sulcus, where the parts of olfactory brain are located. Medially, the straight gyrus located here. Laterally, there are orbital gyri, which are limited by the orbital grooves. Behind it, we have the occipitotemporal sulcus that limits the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus and medial occipitotemporal gyrus. It's limited medially by the collateral sulcus, and from the opposite side of it there is the hippocampi sulcus. Together they limit the parahippocampalis gyrus. The end of the gyrus is called uncus. Where is here? So the medial side, we can see the medial side with the corpus callosum sulcus. the singular sulcus to limit cingulate gyrus. The calcarine and parietal occipital, they limit cuneus. The end of the central and parietal occipital precuneus. And in front the central we have paracentral lobulus. Inferior surface, the olfactory sulcus to limit the straight or rectus gyrus, orbital gyri located aside. Behind it we have the occipitotemporal, lateral and medial gyri, which are limited by the collateral sulcus, and aside with the hippocampus sulcus they limit the parahippocamparis gyrus. The end of this gyrus is called uncus. For what we need to know these gyri and grooves to limit them? Of course, to know the cortical centers of all our analyzers. The first system that was developed during embryogenesis and phylogenesis, the first signal system, has the centers projected in the parts of the cortex, and we should be able to show where are they projected. To start with the centers of the auditory system, centers of hearing, projected in the superior temporal gyrus, in the middle part of the gyrus, the center of hearing. The second is the center of vision. Center of vision will be aside the calcarine sulcus, occipital lobe. We know if it's damaged, the blindness will be formed. The center of the motor analyzer, it's projected in the precentral gyrus. The sensory center, the types of all sensory tracts will be terminated in the postcentral gyrus, will be located here. And the center of taste and smell is projected in uncus, here. At least this one, the first signal system, will be known by heart. Now please open your copies with these stamps of brain. Use any types of pens or pencils. The most important is to write the names. Yes, not to draw, to use the certain color, but to use the names which are demonstrated here on the superior lateral, medial, and inferior surface of brain. Please do it.